Hey everybody, I'm supposedly Layman Pascal, but to quote my mother, who knows what anything really is, I mean honestly. And speaking of interperspectival ignorance, we are joined today by the author of Five Principles of Middle Way Philosophy, subtitled Living Experientially in a World of Uncertainty. We've had Robert M. Ellis on Integral Stage's author series before to talk about the common underlying and diluting or limiting problem of absolutization as a metaphysical tendency. And he's back now to help us explore his next book in the series, prefaced by Ian McGilchrist, which picks up from the critique of absolutization with some positive principles that lead towards sane trans-relativistic sense-making. I'm skeptical of his claims, but apparently he claims that's a good thing, so we're happy to have him back. Hi, Robert.
Hi, thank you, Layman.
For people that don't know your work, maybe let's start with how you define the middle way and how you distinguish it from other possible versions of the middle way.
Okay. Well, I understand the middle way as a principle of judgment. So it's very much about how we respond to what we experience, how we judge from moment to moment, not just kind of big decisions, but also what we assume to be the case, what our values are, and so on. And obviously, it's bringing to bear practice. And awareness, obviously, aware practice to that process of judgment and all the conditions that impact on our judgment through our lives. So in that sense, it obviously has some inspiration from the Buddhist middle way, which is, which I began with more than 20 years ago now, working with. But yeah, it's become something wider. It's been an attempt to take the idea of the middle way that was originally inspired by Buddhism and turn it into something more universal and interdisciplinary, bringing together particularly aspects of Western philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, systems, and embodied meaning. But anything else that seemed useful, really. Yeah, I suppose that's what's distinctive about my understanding of the middle way. It's very practically oriented, so it's very much about avoiding absolute assumptions and metaphysics, and it's very interdisciplinary, and it's very much about the process of judgment rather than grand claims about the universe.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the writings of Nassim Taleb. And one of the things he does is try to point out that our identification with our knowledge models have some severe limitations. And he's very good at sort of mathematically demonstrating what those limitations are and pointing us in the direction of principles that might help us live in a world that we don't understand. And I'm curious about your feeling of those two different approaches to the world. The one approach to the world is sort of, let's figure out as much as we can figure out and trust that, believe in the things that we think we know. And the other strategy is that's really dangerous. That puts us in a position of fragility relative to the fact that in reality there's so much we don't know and we will never know, and so we actually have to double down on embodied procedures for becoming robust against a universe that will always bedevil our understanding. How do you see yourself kind of between those two approaches to life?
Well, they're both balanced in the middle way. There's obviously a need for confidence in making the judgments we make, but nevertheless constantly bearing in mind the uncertainty in which we make those judgments. And that's really the first two principles of the five principles in my book, is skepticism and provisionality. So by skepticism, I mean the general awareness of uncertainty, which can be prompted by skeptical arguments of all kinds, including uncertainty about negative claims. But provisionality is much more about how we positively do make judgments and justify judgments we make in that situation of uncertainty. And there I want to particularly highlight the need for, well, actually Taleb is good at this. He talks about optionality and options. and I've used that idea amongst others in developing the idea of provisionality, and so having options, having awareness of alternatives when we make judgments, I think is crucial to avoiding absolutization, avoiding the assumption that we have the whole story.
Yeah, so this book is largely built around these five principles. Skepticism is really interesting. I like what you said there because it seems like it's a way of affirmatively embracing a world in which we constantly hear different opinions and counter arguments, right? Because that's one of the things that people feel like is an overwhelming and somewhat problematic aspect of the current world is you're constantly exposed to alternative perspectives on absolutely every topic. And so it can seem like something we wish we could get out of. If only we could simplify things or go back or get the right new narrative to make sense of all of it, we'd be in a better position. But the way you're describing it sounds to me like we're actually much better off in a world where people are constantly being skeptical about every claim they hear and bringing their differences of opinion and perspective to bear against each other.
Yeah, I do see skepticism as well as a place that as a principle that naturally takes us to a point of balance, if you like, because if we really take seriously the recognition that skeptical arguments apply just as much to negative claims, for example, you can be skeptical about whether God exists. You can be equally skeptical about the claim that God does not exist. Yeah, they're both equally beyond our experience to justify. So if we take that really seriously in relation to all the uses of skepticism, then we end up with an even-handed, finely balanced position. Not one that tells us everything at all, but one that helps us navigate the conditions that we encounter constantly. So yeah, I see that as the positive basis of the way, if you like. It's one. That's why I start with skepticism in my account of the middle way, because it sort of delineates the rocks on either side of the strait that we're navigating through. And yeah, we've got a certain amount of space in between those rocks. We've got, there wasn't just one correct course, but there is a space within which we optimally navigate to avoid the obvious rocks. So I do think skepticism has this, if it's applied in that way and not misunderstood, then it has this really important sort of positive potential to help us navigate our judgments.
Yeah, I feel like skepticism is a really nice beginning point, and this is something some versions of Buddhism have always done really well, which is start from a place where religion and science are on the same footing, right? There's a way of thinking, of maturely thinking about the world, which says any spirituality we have and any practical scientific understanding we have must begin from this place of acknowledging that we don't know and that multiple possibilities are available to us.
Mm-hmm.
But I think some people worry about that emotionally, right? They worry about the slide from skepticism to cynicism. They worry about are we going to lose our ability to fully emotionally engage if we use a skeptical lens on reality? Don't we have to really believe something in order to be full participants in the meaning-making experience of the world?
Well, we need to believe things, certainly, but that judgment about what to believe, I think, is a practical one. So if at each stage we recognize that our judgment is practical rather than ultimate, then we can just carry on making the judgments we need to make provisionally in our experience. So I don't see any necessary link at all between skepticism, meaning skeptical argument, not a negative position, skepticism as a method, if you like, as a practice. And I see any necessary connection between that and a negative outcome, including, a sense of lack of meaning in one's life as a whole or anything of that kind. In fact, I think it's in the longer term, in the bigger picture, it's a way in which we can find sustainable ways of developing a vision of meaning in our own lives. So that's where I see the middle way, obviously, as being a potential basis for that kind of orientation.
I mean, it's interesting. I get this image of having beliefs within relative contexts and having at least a little bit of consciousness that exceeds those beliefs at every point. But it's not the case that everybody's very good at that. What do you think is required of people in order to be able to be good skeptics?
Well, that's where all the principles of the 5 principles of the middle way come in, really. So particularly the 5th principle, which is integration, which is about the long-term practice that helps us to build up the conditions we need to be able to be provisional in that way. So, yeah, I think I see practice as working at different levels and as basically involving overcoming conflicts in our experience in one way or another. There could be conflicts inwardly with aspects of ourselves or with others in the world. And as we overcome conflicts, we gradually get a bigger view of things. And we also, at the same time as we do that cognitively, we also do it emotionally. So those two things are constantly interdependent. And so we get a larger sense of the point of our lives through that process of integration as we go on. And obviously you can also relate that to theories of psychological development, such as particularly the theories of Robert Kegan, which interest me, which I've written about in my next book, which is coming up more fully. But I think is mentioned in the 5 principles. So yeah, you can also see our process of psychological development as one that gradually helps us to get more to grips with the middle way as we go on, but also one that requires us to apply it in a micro fashion. So there's the sort of big middle way. There's the broad, explicit idea that we can use the middle way to guide us, which we may need quite a lot of educational and psychological development to be able to deal with and use fully. But at the same time, there's also implicitly ways that we can use it all through our lives whenever we've got a difficult transition to make. And we get through those transitions by navigation, by avoiding either absolute extreme. So whether you're making say if you're making a transition from a very sort of group based life to one that's more intellectually open, like somebody going to university for the first time or something like that, what Kegan will call entering stage 4 or the institutional stage. If you're going through that kind of transition and finding it difficult, you'd rather go back to the comforts of your home life and the security, intellectual security of that situation. Then we manage that transition by not absolutizing either side, not hanging on so much that we can't move on, but at the same time not jumping forward too precipitately so that we lose the continuity between those two stages. So I think the middle way is involved implicitly in that way at every stage, that we need to find some sort of balance between absolute assumptions.
I'm interested in the relationship between overcoming conflict in our experience that looks like oscillation or circulation between non-extreme versions of our alternatives, and the approach that looks like finding a new structure that seems to satisfy the parameters of both positions. I just came out of a discussion about Dune 2 right before this call. There's a scene in that movie where there's a political argument within the desert dwellers about whether our main character is truly the Messiah or not. And some of them believe it's just an ideological political manipulation, and some of them believe the prophecy. And he sides with the people who say it's a political manipulation. He says he's not the Messiah. But what that does is it simultaneously wins over the critics and makes the people who believe in him more, because now he's a humble Messiah. So he found a solution that
mm,
incorporated both alternatives. And
mm,
that
mm.
sounds a little bit different than people who sort of move between or try to balance the alternatives. Now, one might be the precursor to the other, but I wonder how you hold those kind of two
Yeah,
strategies about overcoming conflict.
I think they're the flip side of each other, and implicitly, when we use one, we're using the other one. So that's the relationship between the middle way and integration. In well, the strategy that you talked about just then is one of trying to find what's helpful or insightful on both sides of a conflict, and to incorporate it into a wider view, which is reframing. I make a lot of use of the two mules pictures, which is a way of showing that graphically. This way that by taking a wider view, we get beyond the limitations of our previous narrow view. We see things slightly differently, and we're able to then act more effectively. So the two mules that were previously in conflict with each other, trying to eat two different bales of hay, can now eat one and then the other one together, because they've reframed. And so that involves integration. But in order to integrate, you also need the middle way, because if you just stay straining away, trying to eat your two different bales of hay at the same time, you're still absolutizing those different views. You're not in a position to reframe and bring together the best of each of those sides. And you can see that operating, whenever you've got a socially or intellectually based conflict between two ideologies or two religious traditions or anything of that kind, where the two different opposed groups will unite around a bundle of absolute assumptions which are opposed to each other. So to deal with those, we're going to need a combination of not accepting the absolute basis of either of those views, as well as being willing to explore their helpful meaning and integrate it. We're going to need integration and the middle way, and particularly the aspect of the middle way. My fourth principle is agnosticism, which is being pretty determined and deliberate in the way we avoid the absolute assumptions of both sides.
Humans are prey to this thing that we call cognitive dissonance, where two different behavioral impulses go to war in ourselves, and we don't like that, so we double down on believing one of them in most cases. But if what you're saying, if the middle way requires us to overcome conflict in our experience, how do we deal with the problem that most people refuse to encounter the conflict in their experience? They won't tolerate that dissonance, and so they're not even in a position to begin to overcome it because they refuse to experience it. What's required of people to be able to encounter the conflict in themselves?
Well, quite often, we might go on for a long time, not facing up to it. And this is obviously very common. But then changing circumstances can force us to do so. And that's where the sort of experience of frustration can come in. So the Buddhist tradition tracks this quite well in the idea, you encounter frustration or dukkha, sometimes translated as suffering, when things aren't working in some fundamental way, in the way you wanted them to, and then you have to reconsider your assumptions. That dissonance is no longer serving you. You're no longer able to patch it up sufficiently for things to work. We may be forced by events, forced by conditions to reconsider. But of course, people do carry on with that dissonance, and as we see, there are still people who support Trump. There are still people who, the aliens didn't land, and they're still waiting for the aliens. So there's, it's all a question of whether we can adapt our habitual mental states in awareness to face up to that dissonance, when the conditions begin to demand it. Obviously, various kinds of practice then can help us to become more integrated so that we're more likely to start to deal with that dissonance. So that's where practices like mindfulness or the arts or critical discussion, for instance, just to give a few examples, can help us in different ways, to either change our mental states so that they're more open, or to widen our imaginations so we're thinking more possibilities, or to directly discuss and weigh up those new possibilities. Any of those might possibly give us the nudge we need to start to move on when we're stuck.
Yeah. It seems like there's a mental and an emotional and a social aspect to that. So socially, we require some shared idea, like dukkha is a good example, or uh, Taleb's Taleb's work kind of inculcates a positive regard for stressors and confusion. Like we need to be able to say, when you encounter things like this, that might be good. It doesn't have to be something that you reject out of hand.
Mm.
There needs to be a mental training of, critical discussion and debate are good preparatory work for getting the flexibility of mind to not get stuck in absolutes. And there needs to be some kind of emotional capacity that very often we get from um, either the moral act of exposing ourselves to things we don't like or the inner practice aspect of sitting with what distresses us. I wonder if there's anything you'd add to that if you were thinking about how we would set up an educational system for a society that understands the middle way better. Like if you were looking at what pre-skills children would need to be trained in order to start to have a civilization where people were good at this.
Well, broadly, I'd want them to be working at those three levels, really. It would be really good if children were more acquainted at an early age with meditative techniques and helping them to be aware of their mental states and to work with them. So there's that level, and obviously less direct ways of working with your mental states, like body work kind of approaches. But yeah, the imagination and the arts, which have often had their position eroded in education in recent years, at least in the UK, probably US as well, I'd imagine. There's a continuing need really for that kind of work with the imagination as part of education, but there's also the critical thinking and that getting away from the idea that education is about knowledge, because of giving people these true beliefs about how things are that are given them by society that they then reproduce in examinations. That there's that meaning and understanding are dependent on the new weak neural connections we form, so that we've got different possibilities, different ways of responding to new circumstances. So the more we can set children up with those kinds of practices, I suppose, to enable them to work in those ways, those different ways, the better, I think. But a lot of the basic conditions in education, I've worked in education, the education system, and a lot of the basic conditions in education are opposed to that in my experience, but particularly the assessment system and the economic pressures militate against that quite often.
So another one of your 5 principles, which you've mentioned already, is provisionality. What distinguishes a provisional judgment from any other kind of judgment?
Well, obviously the term itself suggests that it can be changed. But if you ask, well, what are the conditions for it being able to change? So we already mentioned that's particularly involves optionality. So having access or awareness of alternative possibilities. Those alternatives don't have to be very strong necessarily. That's why I talk about weak links. They just have to be available to us. And that also means that we need to avoid false dichotomies, which are another way of keeping us within an absolutized perspective. So the false dichotomies tend to be the positive position that we believe in plus the unthinkable negation of it. So, for example, if you're a committed Republican, then anything that's Democrat, well, the opposite is unthinkable. You're going to reject those. So it tends to be lumped in the same box, in the same category, rather than thinking in terms of a variety of possibilities and third or fourth or fifth possibilities other than just those two that we tend to reduce things to when we're absolutizing. So provisionality requires us to think about those multiple possibilities in any given case. So we're not just limited by the framing of the yes or no in this particular yes and this particular no in this particular zone. And see, when you get to more complex judgments, I mean, there's various things in my book about the use of what I call probabilizing, which is not necessarily the formal use of probability as used in science and academia. That could be part of it, but just the process of trying to assess the justification of your beliefs as a matter of degree. So assessing all your reasons for believing whether something is true or not, or whether it's correct or not, on a scale. And that's also related to the principle of incrementality, which is my third principle. The value of moving beyond that binary assumption of yes or no, deliberately trying to get beyond that yes or no by thinking, well, how much is this justified? And then trying to pull together the evidence you have available or the reasons you have available to at least compare different positions on a scale, even if it's a very rough, not at all scientifically precise scale, but some kind of scale. Just using a scale helps us to get beyond that yes-no binary without having to go all the way with scientific probability necessarily. So there's that idea there of probabilizing, and then when we finally make a judgment about something, particularly if it's important, weighing it up. So rather than thinking in terms of the kind of the correct solution as opposed to the opposite solution, if we give it a little bit more time, slowness is another aspect of this, that where we can, practically speaking, we need to slow down and just consider the weight of each of the options that we're considering, how likely they are to be acceptable. So it's you can see that as a process of decision making, which is obviously does draw on existing traditions in science and critical thinking, but it tries to make those approaches more sort of immediate and practical in all situations, not just it's like a formal scientific situation backed up by a lot of social peer reviewing and social backup and so
on. I'm thinking of the image of a cat running into a glass door. And this cat is extremely confident and then hits the door and tries to leave, maybe with the same level of confidence as if that's what it had in mind the whole time. And, that's a very simple level of minds being changed. But you could argue that, in effect, every being is provisional in its assessments at all times. Like there's no position that can't be changed. But we don't always recognize that fact.
Mm.
what's gained in a system where all judgments are provisional? What's gained by self-awareness of that fact? Why be conscious of provisionality if it's built into the system anyway? Why not just completely believe and then sometimes change into another belief?
Well, because as you've already mentioned, talking about cognitive dissonance, we don't always recognize it. Um, so we don't always use apply provisionality when it will be helpful to us. And that biologically comes down to, if you think about McGilchrist's work, the left hemisphere, right hemisphere, the different specialized functions of those hemispheres, and that it's the right hemisphere that makes us aware of new information and allows us to adjust our approaches. And if we're in an over-dominant left hemisphere state that just continues with the same representation of the situation, then we may fail to make that adjustment. So where we need to keep, given the biological and cultural pressures to over-dominate the left hemisphere, we need to be constantly aware of the need to integrate the hemispheres and to allow the right hemisphere to feed us more information so we can adjust our beliefs as we go. So it's very much it's a product of the particular circumstances that human beings find themselves in, and particularly at this point in history, in Western civilization. But I'm generally convinced by Ian McGilchrist's explanation of how that came about. Really, there's this the left-right division and the tendency of the left hemisphere to focus on prey and the right hemisphere to focus on awareness of threats. It goes back to early fish, and all other animals evolving from that point onwards. And then humans got into a particular state where that became more important to them because of the geometrical or exponential expansion of the human brain in primate and early hominid evolution. So as both parts of the brain, as all the parts of the brain expanded rapidly, that led to an overdominance of the left. That's quite well explained in the beginning of McGilchrist's latest book, most of which I don't like very much, but the early bit of it is really helpful. And he explains that scientific situation. But basically that's, whatever the reasons for it, we're landed in this situation where humans have this tendency to have an overdominant left hemisphere, which is reinforced in all these cultural ways, and has led us into all these problems, biggest one being the environmental crisis or crises. And so we need to be able to respond to that, basically. So we can't just say, well, we're provisional anyway, because obviously we're not provisional enough. We're not responding enough to what's happening around us, either collectively or individually most of the time. So therefore, we need to practice it.
I tend to think socio-technologically about the, let's say, fall into left brain dominance. I feel like our ancestors up to 8,000 years ago might have been pretty balanced, even with expanded brain capacity and living in something that we might think of as a trance state or a slightly altered way of doing waking consciousness, up until the point where writing and ensconcement in cities, and I think to some degree pottery as a kind of manufacturable technology where you decide and then replicate rather than find the shapes in the stones, that these technological things start to create a feedback loop that favor the left brain, which is later accelerated by paper tools such as maps and books and things like that. How does that land with you?
Okay, now we're getting very much onto the topic of my next book, which is all about this kind of historical aspect of it, or evolutionary aspect of it. But I think that that's probably one of the elements but yeah, there are all kinds of feedback loops that work in human culture. Well, it starts off with feedback loops in life, but those feedback loops gradually become more and more intense and more and more dominant, particularly as we get into the human period, as it were. And then elements of our culture accelerate it. So, you can talk about all kinds of things that are fed into that. Technology certainly can be one of them. But there's also the general philosophical assumptions we've made, and particularly the way our education and scientific systems have reflected those, so that they're constantly reinforcing sort of representationalism. So they're reinforcing the idea that we know things and we've got this representation of the world which is true. This is sort of left brain way of understanding things, and that's what a lot of people see education as doing. It's giving us this knowledge, and anything else will often be assessed in terms of, does it tell us the truth? Does it give us knowledge, etc., rather than in terms of processes and judgments and method, which I think will be much more adequate ways of approaching these things. So there's a whole load of intellectual assumptions, and quite often, if you try and track where those intellectual assumptions started, they may go back into the Paleolithic, but they're pretty difficult to track quite often. But my next book will attempt to do that in various ways, different aspects of human culture, and try and show the relationship between that culture and the biology and also the psychological development of human beings, but all with a focus on how do we change the process, how do we change the judgment, and what is the background information we need to understand how we change it, rather than making cosmic claims about stages of development in the universe or the omega point or any of that stuff, which I do encounter in integralism and metamodernism. So that's where I want to be practically focused. And so there's a lot we could say about those different things, but maybe we can have a more detailed discussion when my next book comes out on those.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that discussion. But coming back to the things that this book and its principles bring up for me, I'm curious about two different ways of getting beyond monological focus, singular, absolutized, identified thought systems, because one seems to be a dynamic reciprocal binary, and one seems to be a plurality. And in the Eastern systems, epitomized in the yin-yang symbol, there's this notion, same as left brain, right brain, that if you have two complementary systems that aren't getting fixated, that they can largely summarize everything else in reality and avoid the problem of getting locked down in any of the two alternatives. But it's very easy to critique that, especially in a modern sense where we say, look, there aren't just two genders, or, yeah, you've got two brain hemispheres, but there's neural tissue in your heart and your solar plexus in your gut. There's a huge panoply of things going on. How do you relate to that difference between a really good binary and a plurality? What are the limitations and utilities of each of those for you?
Well, there is a utility, there's a practical requirement for binaries, in the sense that when we make a practical judgment, we have to assume a state of affairs, a background for making that judgment, and then act as though that was the case. So when I sit down on a chair, I have to assume it will bear my weight, and that it won't collapse. There's a and that's a binary, if you like, and it's not practical for me to remain uncertain about whether the chair will bear my weight every time I sit on it. So there's a role for binaries, but in a sense, those binaries are always contextualized, or can be contextualized in something wider. So when there's a problem with the chair, I become aware of that problem. Then I realize, oh, we might collapse the next time I sit on it, so I've got to do something about this. And that's where the binary judgment has to be re-examined, has to be reframed, and maybe I make more binary judgments, but then that's in the context of a bigger frame. So that's where I see, binaries really need to be confined to that practical context and contextualized in that way, rather than projecting what is a function of how we operate onto the universe. The binaries aren't out there, and you can then have arguments about mathematics and things of that kind. But it seems to be very often there are models which we're accustomed to use, which are they're contingent on us using them, and they seem to fit the universe. They have done so far, maybe, but that doesn't give them an absolute status. It doesn't entitle us to think that the universe is binary in any sense. So we have a set of uncertainties, a set of unknowns out there. It's contingent and modulated and plural. A lot of the time we just don't know the ultimates. We have to take that into account as much as we can. But at the same time, we have to take into account our practical limitations in that we do have to make judgments, and we do have to make binary assumptions from day to day, as long as we circumscribe those.
So that sounds like you're saying heuristic provisional binaries against a background of indefinite pluralities.
Yeah, you could put it that way. Yeah. Though, obviously, the plurality is phenomenal there. It's not that I want to say there's some pluralism, metaphysical pluralism about the universe. I don't know whether the universe is one or many or whatever. I just have no opinion on that. I remain agnostic on those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit last time, because to me there's a very interesting option that appears in a moment of self-articulation like the one you just gave, which is, who knows what the universe really is? But that's also sort of a claim. There's a bit of a metaphysics to that. You go, the universe is such that one can't really determine whether it's a multitude or a singularity. And then that's a bit like saying whatever it really is the kind of thing that allows for that to exist. That there might be a structural element, the fidelity to which is expressed by the statement that one doesn't know and can't know whether it's a plural or a singular.
Maybe, but I don't see the need or the help in making such a sort of metaphysical claim. I prefer to stick to the phenomenal level. Yeah, so I can say, yeah, I encounter differences, and I use differences in these ways, and I also encounter similarities, and I work with those in these particular ways as well. That seems to me all I need to say in order to try and make better judgments about what I encounter. I don't need to make any claims about their ultimate relationship or to do that. And there's always this danger, if one starts off with well-intentioned, complex metaphysical formulations like Ian McGilchrist, that they will start to become equivocal, and they will get associated with existing metaphysical systems, and they will start slipping into absolutizations of one kind or another. So why not just leave them aside and make the language as clear as possible so that we do avoid them? Because the history is pretty clear, that there's so much. Maybe what started with sincere attempts to engage with uncertainty, that's just still ended up in dogma. Right back in the circle. These complex formulations that became dogmas again. So let's just avoid the circle. Let's just start with uncertainty and carry on with practicality. I don't see why we can't do that.
I appreciate the straightforwardness and the caution in that position. So this principle of incrementality fascinates me, and it's one of the things that I look for in thinkers to see whether I'm going to respect them or not, to see if they're thinking in terms of a distribution of different degrees of intensity as opposed to singular or binary blocks of thinking. And I'm curious how similar or different you think incrementality is to like topological approaches in mathematics and physics, where we think about not a singular amount, but a distribution of different amounts, like the landscape of where an electron is located. We used to feel like a particle was somewhere, and if you go through the Schrodinger equation, you're like, well, it's a lot over here and a little bit over here and a lesser amount over here. There's a kind of landscape of many hills of different sizes rather than just one mountain. Do you relate incrementality to topological approaches?
I can't say I have particularly, no. I mean, I haven't particularly studied topology, so I'm innocent of that particular kind of approach. But it sounds as though it's a way of approaching incrementality or a way of interpreting it from what you're saying.
One of the things you mentioned earlier, I think when incrementality came up, was the importance of slowing down and weighing things. And I'm curious, it's descriptive, it's qualitative, it's phenomenological, but where is that weight? How do people find the weights with which to weigh the probabilities?
Well, it's I'd say there are broadly two elements to it. One of them is the consistency of the evidence that they encounter in their experience. And the other is the recognition of uncertainty. So, yeah, the first of those is broadly consistent with what in epistemology is known as coherentism. That is, where you try and construct the most justified position based on what is most coherent, taking into account all the evidence available to you. But what that misses out, I think, is that some positions can be constructed dogmatically in that they're not taking into account sort of basic uncertainty when they're created, as it were. So I think that's also a good way of checking justification of our beliefs. If we ask ourselves, well, basically, are these beliefs or these suggested beliefs formulated in a way that takes into account our limitations? You know, do they sort of step up and assume that we're God in some way? And quite often, when you look more carefully at a lot of beliefs, people suggest they've got this absolute assumption somewhere that they start with. So that also forms part of the justification, I think, and again can help us. So, and you get quite an immediate sense of that probably if you're dealing with people who are engaged in some kind of deep conflict. You know, so like say a polarized political conflict. You know, you can hear quite often the assumptions that they make based on dogmatic assumptions. You know, so like that the other group are always wrong, or that say it's the justice versus freedom thing that you often get in left-right politics. You know, so that freedom is always right and justice isn't important, or that justice is always right and freedom isn't important. You know, that if people just assume that one of those is the whole story and the other isn't part of the story at all, then it's quite easy to then just rule that out, practically speaking, and say, well, this doesn't look as though it's going anywhere because it's not taking into account a lot of the conditions that we need to deal with. So let's focus on the more complex or better formulated approaches. that do take these different things into account, that don't assume they've got the whole story. So we're avoiding dogma, but yes, when we've avoided the dogmas, we still then got a lot of evidence, and we sort of balance out the values we have when we're judging that evidence to try and reach a justified position. But by justified position, I don't mean a position that we know to be finally right. I just mean one that's somewhere in the middle way, that's based on the best use we can make of our experience.
I love the image of weighing scales as the ancient symbol of wisdom and the sort of suggestion to ponder things in an oppositional dynamic context. And there's something about weight that's very visceral. And part of my interest in this question is that I find myself sometimes making very intellectual decision contests, and other times sort of somatically or proprioceptively moving back and forth between what just seem like visceral intensities, closer to just the experience of the heaviness of things. And sometimes I find my best decisions are from just sensing something that literally feels like weight in my body that I hope encompasses the complexity of the different data sets that I'm using to make that decision.
Yeah, I mean, that takes us to the whole interesting area of intuitions and how we get these intuitions that we might feel in our bodies about what's right and what isn't. And as I understand intuitions, they're formed from unconsciously processed experience over a period of time. So particularly if you're very familiar with a particular kind of condition or an environment, then you get a sense of the best way to navigate it. So like the great example from Daniel Kahneman is, that firefighters know when a building's about to collapse. They've just got a sense of it. And I think that often applies with people as well. When we trust people or distrust people, we just got a sense that they're trustworthy or not, and we can't articulate that in a very precise way. So yeah, I don't think we could ignore that. The intuitions feed in, but at the same time, we can't just take the intuitions as the whole basis of our judgment without giving them any context, because the intuitions only really work if they are based on experience and on a build-up of experience. And that's where I think we should particularly distrust what we think of intuitions that are about the whole universe in some way, because we haven't had experience of the whole universe. So they're not really built on anything. They're sort of channeled intellectualizations more than everything. So when we're trying to weigh things up, things do have emotional weights. I agree, not just numerical or they don't have to be numerical, but scalar things that we've worked out intellectually. But yeah, we need to try and take into account both in the weighing that we do. So the weighing, is in some ways somatic, but it's also intellectual. We need to try and bring them together as we weigh things up and take them both into account.
One of the things I really appreciate about Daniel Kahneman's work is his attempt to make suggestions about which kind of decision systems apply to which kinds of contexts. So if it's something that your ancestors repeatedly experience in a consistent way, then your snap judgment might be good. I think he says if it's a complicated, trivial thing like which toothbrush to buy, you might want to use just system 2 analytic reasoning. But if it's something significant, you might want to do a lot of analytic reasoning and then wait and make a snap decision, allowing both of those systems to work together. Yeah, I don't really have a question about that. It's just something that delights me about Kahneman's work.
Yeah, I agree with that very much. Yeah, that which system we use predominantly depends very much on the context and what we're dealing with. But probably we won't be best advised just to use one of them without the other at all.
The intuition question is something that bedevils me a little bit because um, I'm undecided. I'm agnostic about it. Part of me thinks, yeah, it's pretty obvious that our intuitive capacities have developed in a particular historical and spatial and biological landscape. So we've trained that capacity to be good at making certain kinds of complex anticipations. That might be able to exceed our rational calculation. But in other areas that we haven't been exposed to, we might not be very good at that. On the other hand, I think you said we haven't experienced the whole universe, but in a way, that's also our ecosystem. We've also been, and all of our ancestors have been in this universe, in the physics of this universe, within the computational algorithms that create this reality, so to speak. So I can't really tell how narrowly applicable or broadly applicable our intuition might be. I understand that it is cultivated out of our adaptive historical landscape, but that adaptive historical landscape is both very local and very general at the same time.
Uh, yeah, but given our limitations, it's much more likely to be local, isn't it? I mean, given how little we know about most of the universe, even most of our own planet, and other people, and so on. It's yeah. We do need general judgments, but I think those general judgments need to be based as far as possible on experience rather than on top-down kind of judgments where we think we know what the universe is like and then work it out from there. And
Well, I mean,
that's
this is sort of what
sorry.
like mathematicians in sort of the Platonic sense of
Mm.
mathematicians have always pointed to this possibility that we understand 2 + 2 = 4 out of a lot of local encounters, but
Mm.
out of those encounters, we develop an intuition that's symbolized by that equal sign. But our sense is that's a broadly applicable intuition, that it also applies on other planets and in other galaxies. So we might have locally developed intuitions which are nonetheless non-local in their applicability.
They may be, or they may not be. And I just think it's way too arrogant to assume that they must. Um, the idea of laws of nature or mathematical laws applying throughout the universe. Maybe it works so far, and that's fine, and let's carry on using it as long as it works. But that's not at all the same as assuming that it's universal in the full sense of the universe. Um, and and that's why I think we need to be very careful about sort of top-down deductions from laws of physics or mathematics, particularly to areas that are not clearly physics or mathematics. Like drawing further philosophical conclusions from physics, for example.
Yeah, I find myself very, it's a bit like when you were saying, that God exists versus God does not exist, that you want to have a skepticism toward both assertions.
Hmm.
I'm very comfortable not being able to tell the range of applicability of human intuitions, right? There's a skepticism. You say, well, there's no way, it's extremely unlikely that what we've developed on this planet with these kinds of brains is going to be universally applicable. But on the other hand, that's the very brain that makes that conclusion. We just have no way to tell whether it's universally applicable or not.
Yeah, but in that position of not being able to tell,
Mhm.
then I think the emphasis needs to be much more cautious. And I think the grounds for saying that are our record of how we use the left hemisphere and the effects it's had. So we we should pay attention to the effects of our own judgments and try and modify them in relation to what's happened.
Do you have a different feeling in human to human communication when people are expressing these sort of agnostic or pro mystery positions about the ontology of reality? Because I get a sense that there's something there's kind of an interesting mutuality between people who are willing to have that conversation that's distinct from the mutuality of people who aren't able or willing to have that conversation.
So by that conversation, do you mean conversations where metaphysical claims are made, or what?
Conversations where agnosticism about conclusions are made. Like we're having a verbal social communication here. We're using our reason, but we're also both frequently citing uncertainties. And then that becomes part of a communication that makes it a little bit different than everyday communication.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously, because what we're trying to do is, in this kind of communication, is take the widest possible view, the most adequate view that we can take. So we're making a special effort in this kind of context to do that. That's what I see philosophy as being for, if you like. It's got a practical point to it, which is that it considers things more widely than people normally consider things. And in the process, it can be more adequate because it takes into account our degree of ignorance and how new conditions may affect us. So obviously, yeah, and there is also an intuitive side to that, if you like, that when people do start to take that kind of agnosticism seriously, then yes, it does change the nature of the conversation, and it becomes a more adequate conversation, quite often emotionally as well as intellectually.
You mentioned the kind of social dialectic between justice and freedom. And it made me think of many conversations I'm in sort of integral or coherent pluralist theory space with people where they jump immediately to say, well, that's because justice and freedom are two aspects of the same higher order structure. Now, it seems like that's a little bit too easy a jump to make. On the other hand, we have interesting physics that says, for example, the Heisenberg principle shows that position and momentum are somehow the same thing, that at a very basic level, those two parameters are entangled. You can't measure one without distorting the other one because somehow it's the same piece of information that just looks like two different pieces at normal human scales. And I'm curious because I'm sure you want to be skeptical about the possibility of taking any two things and assuming there's some sort of higher order metaphysical one thing. On the other hand, it does look like it's quite practical in certain areas to find things that looked like two and turned out to be one.
It can be, yes, but you have to go through the process of actually reframing and finding some more adequate way of thinking about it. And usually I think it's to do that, it's enough to recognize, say, that justice and freedom are not the whole story. And obviously you can break that up further. You can identify particular sorts or interpretations of justice and what that means, and similarly with freedom. And again, you can find that none of those are the whole story. And the same with other, if you're using Haidt's 6 foundations, sort of socio-political foundations, then you could also say care and loyalty, then purity and authority. None of those are the whole story either. I don't see that as finding a higher principle that we can then deduce things from, because any attempt to do that is likely to just lead to us getting back to the delusion we have the whole story, we have the true principle by which we can organize things, and then trying to apply that. But if we work bit by bit, like the two mules, so we recognize that we got a conflict here, and we got these people who believe in freedom and these people who believe in justice, and they've got different sorts of insights, and they're in conflict with each other in this situation. Then we look more broadly at that situation, see, for example, what human needs are at stake here. The human need for justice, so that everyone's got enough to eat, for instance, or has housing, whatever, equity, but also the human need to be able to explore and come to new judgments and new conclusions, and creatively find, develop new possibilities. It's possible to combine those two things, isn't it? It's possible to have a society with some equity, where, for example, I'm not saying that only the state can be the adjustment mechanism, but supposing the state does have some kind of welfare mechanism that gives everyone a basic livelihood, then that could be combined with the kind of creativity and freedom that people need at the same time. But maybe they still have to pay their taxes to support the welfare state. So it's not an absolute freedom, and it's not an absolute justice either. So you can reach that practical conclusions just by not absolutizing either side. You don't have to come up with some absolute amalgam of the two to do that.
That makes me curious how much of a role fear plays in all of this, because you could say to somebody, look, what we really want is a system that increases justice and freedom, that increases competitive dynamism and welfare security for people. And I think a lot of them don't even process it mentally. They process it through a kind of reactive scarcity mentality where they're pretty sure if any other thing gets anything, it's being taken out of their bucket. So how much of this is just driven by this feeling that there isn't enough abundance to justify other possibilities?
That's very often what I feel the conservative response is based on. Yes, that there's a scarcity mentality, but obviously there can be those reactions from the left as well, but that's more kind of response to a threat or a threat of perceived injustice or whatever. To take this back to the psychology, obviously there's the reptilian brain leaping into action. There's the fight or freeze response, and we're trying to find a shortcut solution, which keeps feeding into our representations of the situation. So we allow those sort of shortcut solutions to impose themselves on our beliefs as we keep making new judgments about things, and to maintain absolute judgments because of that. So this is where mindfulness and relaxation feed into our capacity to be provisional, and where there is evidence, for example, that mindfulness helps people overcome biases. So if you can relax that process of the reptilian brain coming up with unnecessary, unhelpful fear, for instance, then that can help you make better judgments by avoiding absolute assumptions. And there again, you've got that relationship between integration, overcoming conflict within yourself, and finding a more adequate judgment in the situations you find yourself.
I've moved pretty fluidly between a lot of different religious frameworks in my life, but there's something special about Christianity in this culture that I think to be in a post-Christian culture is to be in a kind of a Christian culture. It's part of the deep sense-making structure we inherit. And even though I don't know the historical circumstances, it seems to me, first of all, extremely unlikely that the magical events are true, but I've also come to err on the side of not even thinking that Jesus was a historical person. I don't see much evidence for that. But none of that has inhibited my ability to have a visionary, mystical, emotional, and cultural relationship to the principles of Christianity and to the figure of Christ. I'm curious because I know that agnosticism is one of the main principles in this book, but you've also done a book on Christianity. How do you see Christianity and agnosticism working together?
In a pair of words, Christian agnosticism, which is what I suggest in my book, The Christian Middle Way. agnosticism is a way of making the best use of experience. Yes, so we avoid absolutizing assumptions, and you can apply that to any tradition, I think, because traditions have entrenched absolutizations quite often. So Christianity obviously does have those in its classic creedal expressions. You know, that then the idea you have to believe this in order to be Christian. These various metaphysical claims, but there's also a great deal else in the Christian tradition which is not dependent on those kind of absolute creedal claims, and that's where I think the Ninian Smart's analysis of the dimensions of religion can be helpful. So we can remind ourselves that religions are full of myths and stories. They're full of rituals. They've got social groupings that support people. They've got religious experience. You know, they've got these symbolic material things and buildings, and they've got these techniques and approaches, prayer and meditation, and so on, all of which can feed into our practice and particularly inspire us in one way or another. So yeah, in one of our previous conversations about my book Archetypes in Religion and Beyond, we talked more about that and the way in which inspiration can be archetypally gained from the associations we have with symbols, which may be in a particular religion. So that's where I think it's important to separate meaning from belief, and that so we can be entirely agnostic about absolute beliefs. We can try and make our beliefs practical and provisional, and at the same time we can recognize that a religious tradition and religious symbols may have important meaning for us, which inspires us, which reminds us of what's most valuable and important to us. So for me, that would, in one way or another, remind me of the middle way or integration, broadly speaking, will prompt me towards continuing practice of the middle way. So that's why I like, for example, to interpret the kinds of tensions within the figure of Christ, say, in terms of the middle way. You know, so on the one hand, Christ is human, and on the other, he's divine. So you've got this absolute claim of sort of idealized claim of this infinite position, and then you've got this limited human perspective, and holding those together in apparent contradiction is what the middle way often involves. You know, as long as we can hold those two things symbolically in tension, and then find a practical way of expressing that in practice. So one could have the figure of Christ as an inspirational symbol of what it is to practice the middle way, I think.
There's something very nice about Christian agnosticism in terms of thinking of agnosticism as a wiser and more competent way to experience your Christianity, just as scientific Gnosticism or Buddhist agnosticism would be a wiser, more competent way to experience it. And I'm curious, how, let's say, natural and how developed that capacity is. I had a beautiful time with my very rural uncle years ago, and I asked him about some plants, and he said, well, around here we call them mountain blackberries. And it struck me how open to relativity and contextualism, but also how folksy and straightforward and simple that statement was. And I'm in a lot of discussions with people who feel like cognition develops through phases of complexity, and it's more complex to be able to hold something in a way that is open to it, but doesn't get overly drawn into it, that these are very sophisticated cognitive moves. But on the other hand, it seems so simple and so basic that, to ride a horse or to use a hammer, you have to hold it tightly, but not too tightly. In order to do any functional thing, there has to be a balance of how you hold it. Do you think of this as something that needs to be developed and learned, or do you think of it as something that's like really basic and built into us and typically gets interfered with socially for some reason?
I think it's largely learned. Yeah. Obviously, it depends on our human capacities, both genetic and epigenetic. The capacities we might develop from our particular heritage and our culture as well. Um, so there are all kinds of routes that we draw on, and the middle way may be easier to practice in some contexts than others, certainly. But nevertheless, wherever we start, we can develop in that direction. We can start to apply the middle way, and we can, recognize the particularity of our situation, like your uncle seems to have implicitly done, and but also work, provisionally develop generalities and develop more universal perspectives, and we need to try to do that, to have an expectation that we can develop wider views of things and keep trying out wider views of things, whilst recognizing that we're never going to get ultimate views of things.
Well, we're coming to the end of this thing. Is there anything else you would really love to say about your book that I haven't asked you about?
Shall I just run through the 5 principles so that everyone's clear about them? Yeah.
Sure, that would be great.
So the 5 principles which are discussed in the book are skepticism, provisionality, incrementality, agnosticism, and integration. So skepticism, as we mentioned at the beginning, is about recognizing uncertainty. It's not about having a negative position. So that, some people have called that Pyrrhonism, or Jason Storm calls it Zeticism, was the other. So there's other names that people have given to that. I just think it's about applying skeptical argument. And provisionality is about making judgments positively, but with awareness of alternatives. Incrementality is about trying to see things as a matter of degree, making our judgments more effective by thinking in that way rather than in terms of binaries, yes or no. Agnosticism is about having a clear avoidance of those absolute yes and no positions, even when there's a lot of group pressure, to join the A's or the Nays. So it's not just about God, it's about a whole load of other absolute claims that people make. And then the integration is a broad term for how we can, through that process of the middle way, that can help us to positively bring together the insights and the experience that we get from opposing quarters, opposing sides. So once we've stopped absolutizing them, we're able to see how they can all contribute to our view of things. So integration then also has these different levels that we can practice it, which I call desire, meaning, and belief. That we can work with our desires through meditation, say, with meaning through the imagination, and belief through philosophy and critical thinking. So my book works through those 5 principles, and then the final section is called practice, and that's very much about going in more detail about the range of different things, range of different practices we can have, which contribute towards the middle way. So all of these are already established practices. There's a whole wide range of them, but I'm trying to just pull them together so that you see them in a wider frame. So from meditation to psychotherapy to political activity of various kinds, so to the arts and so on. Both at an individual and also at a social or political level. So yeah, that's a rough outline of my book, really, and that structure of how it works, and it's the kind of most important, I think, the central book of the series that I'm developing, called Middle Way Philosophy, of which absolutization was the first that we discussed before. But there's more volumes coming up. There's more volumes in the process now. One will come out in June this year, the next one. Yeah, a lot of the background details about meaning, for example, about the biology and the cultural background, about biases, about ethics and politics and so on, all will be spelled out in more detail in some of the subsequent volumes.
Well, I quite like your 5 principles, and I find you very pleasant to chat with. And I think there's a lot of people in the communities that I circulate in who are partly living out these principles already. So it's very nice to see someone clarifying what those principles are and putting them together in a broader philosophical heuristics as to what characterizes a wiser way for human beings to be in the world. And I'm very much looking forward to the historical and technological conversation that we'll have at some point. So thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you very much, Layman. It's a very interesting conversation. Thanks.